It's time to examine some close-up photography. So as we look at the extreme close-up, we're looking for a very close-up view of an activity that we typically don't pay that much attention to. In an ideal world, it's going to require a specialized lens. In a less than ideal world, you're going to have to crop in quite a bit to make this work. And we're looking for some context because we want to do storytelling photos here. So close-up photography simply means that your subject is much closer to the camera than normal. So if we look at this picture of a fishing lure, this is taken with a 50mm lens, focused as close as possible on that fishing lure. That lure is maybe a 2-inch long lure, so we've got a ruler in there for reference. We can crop in on the lure to get much closer, but we start to degrade the image quality because we're literally just throwing out the extra pixels. We haven't magnified the image that much. True macro photography involves using a specialized lens. Nikon calls them micro lenses. Canon and Sony call them macros. But the idea is that it simply focuses closer than a regular lens does. So here's the same lure photographed with a 105mm micro lens. And this is a magnification ratio of 1 to 2.8. Meaning that the actual image on the sensor is 2.8 times smaller than the actual sensor. So, but we can see the image quality is much better here than it was in the cropped version. Look, for example, down around the hook where the hook and the lure meet, and look at this versus the cropped version, and you can see that the proper macro lens is much sharper. And then we can crop that image a little further to really get in close. You can see the scales that are painted on the front of the lure. And by getting in closer, we're using either an extension tube or a bellows, both of which simply put a little more distance between the lens and the camera. And that's how you focus closer. Working at a very close distance is a little different than working at a normal distance. Your depth of field decreases as the subject gets closer to the camera. And by the time you're within inches, that depth of field is really critical. Aperture matters. So with a 50mm lens that's 12 inches from your subject, at f4, your depth of field is about a 1/16 of an inch front to back. And at f11, the depth of field definitely increases, but it's still only about a 1/2 inch. So there's not much room to be in or out of focus. The magnification is expressed as a ratio. We looked at this a second ago. So a 50mm lens, maximum magnification is about 10% of the subject size, and that's a 1 to 10 ratio. Okay, in other words, the sensor is 10 times smaller than the object is in real life. If it's life size on the sensor, we would call that 1 to 1. In other words, a 1-inch subject in reality occupies 1 inch on the sensor. So our best practice, you want to get an extreme close-up of somebody doing something that's fairly recognizable. Focus really close on your subject because you want those details. And instead of just photographing the fishing lure by itself, let's do a storytelling image that gives it some context. For example, a close-up of that lure being tied onto the line, or the lure being removed from the mouth of a fish. Here's a lovely picture of a plump, juicy strawberry. So what's missing from this photo that would make it more visually appealing? How about somebody actually eating that strawberry and telling the story of what you do with that fruit? And it's a much more visually appealing photo, and it kind of makes you want to eat a strawberry. Give us a view of something we wouldn't normally look at. So again, here's a picture of a Monopoly game, but this is a little different view of Monopoly than you typically see it. Candid photos are best, but you may need to pose the picture or have somebody hold it or repeat an action. Again, here, looking at that shallow depth of field, we notice the front of the red house is sharp, and we notice the fingers are out of focus. So if they don't stay still for a minute, you're going to have a lot of trouble focusing on that. Be aware that when you're in that close to something, you may be in the somewhat literal splash zone. So be aware of what's going on as you get in that close and tell that story. Here's a really nice close-up picture, but it just identifies the subject. It's not really telling a story. I mean, if looks could kill, but we're just identifying the cat here. We're not talking about what the cat's doing. So in summary, we're looking for a really close-up view of an activity that we don't normally see at that scale. It's going to require either a specialized lens or some tight cropping, and the reality for this class is probably the tight cropping. And the best practice, you want to give some context and you want to tell a story with that photo. So good luck and have some fun with this one.